Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. India unshackled itself from British imperialism, today becoming a free nation. Since then, it has exercised its own imperialism in occupied Kashmir, which it has also annexed now. Since August 4, the valley is under siege and there's communication blackout. According to moderate estimates, over 3,000 people, including 3 former chief ministers, Dr. Farooq Abdullah, Omar Abdullah, and Mehbooba Mufti, former cabinet ministers like Naeem Akhtar, an outspoken bureaucrat turned politician Shah Faisal, are either jailed under Public Safety Act or detained for maintaining law and order or placed under house arrest to bring peace. Those imprisoned inside Kashmir or sent to outside jails also include hundreds of politicians from the Unionist camp, the National Conference and the People's Democratic Party, scores of civil society actors, lawyers, traders, workers, and sympathizers of the pro-independence camp, socio-religious groups, and other community leaders. To discuss the situation in occupied and now annexed Kashmir, we are joined by our correspondent in Delhi, Neha, Poonia, Dr. Moeed Yusuf, who is Associate Vice President, Asia Center at the USIP. Let me begin with Neha here. Neha, what exactly is the situation? I mean, there's just bits and pieces, nuts and bolts kind of filtering out, but nothing more than that.
It's been 11 days since that clampdown was put in place in Jammu and Kashmir, and since then, like you said, very little information has been coming out, at least from Kashmir. We have heard of accounts that have filtered out because many residents of that region have travelled out to Delhi and have been speaking to members of the press, and they're saying there's a lot of anger on the ground that people of Kashmir feel betrayed by the Indian government's move on revoking Article 370. As far as the security situation is concerned, in light of Independence Day, the Indian government has deployed about 150,000 troops in Jammu and Kashmir. They're patrolling the streets 24/7, and the government claims there's a red alert in place because there's intelligence of some kind of attack that may be in the planning. As far as the information restrictions are concerned, internet lines are still down, cable TV is still suspended, as is landlines in Kashmir, and the government says that after Independence Day celebrations on August 15th, there could be a phased easing out of these restrictions.
Okay, so let's keep Kashmir aside for a while. Let's just go back to the way in which this exercise has been conducted. And this exercise essentially has been, okay, so we know that BJP had this on the agenda in terms of their political manifesto, but most people thought that this is something which is now carved in stone. And I'm talking about the special status because the Constituent Assembly that brought it into being then dissolved itself. So the body that could change this does not exist anymore. So the idea was, how are they going to go about this? So they have essentially hollowed out 2 constitutional articles, Article 3 of the Indian Constitution and 367, in order to essentially revoke 370. Now, does this, the manner in which this has been done in terms of the federalism of India, does this actually concern constitutionalists, people who think that India as a constitutional democracy is an entity that has to exercise great caution in how it deals with its own constitution?
On this entire matter, Ejaz, there are 2 voices that have largely come out from different parts of the country. One, of course, are the thousands of people who support Prime Minister Modi's decision on this. They believe that this will genuinely lead to the larger integration of Jammu and Kashmir with the rest of the country. And on the other side, like you said, there are concerns being voiced by various legal experts. Was this constitutional? Manner in which this was carried out legal at all? Like you said, the Constituent Assembly of Jammu and Kashmir should have technically ratified this, but we've not had a government in place there since last year, and there's been an extended period of the rule of the federal government here in New Delhi that's carried on. In light of that, the government says the power to approve this was transferred to Parliament, which is why this a bill to approve the revocation of that special status for Jammu and Kashmir was brought to Rajya Sabha and then Lok Sabha last week. So the government claims that it followed due procedure. It also maintains this was a temporary provision in India's constitution, and they've tweaked this using that very same provision which was in place in India's constitution as well. But like you said, there are questions about the legality of all of this. There are challenges pending in India's Supreme Court, including one from opposition parties in Jammu and Kashmir. So we'll know in some time what the legality of this is as far as India's top court is concerned.
Okay, so, someone is going to take this to the Supreme Court of India, and one expects that perhaps the Supreme Court will look at it in proper constitutional terms, because what they did when I referred to hollowing out 367 had the formulation Constituent Assembly, which was quietly changed to Legislative Assembly. And since, as you mentioned, it's been a year, there is no Legislative Assembly. So having changed the original formulation, which was actually the sticking point in all this, they kind of paved the way in terms of this constitutional sort of night raid to be able to say then that, well, we adopted a certain procedure, and since there is no Legislative Assembly, it's the Lok Sabha that, it devolves on the Lok Sabha to do this. But I think that's a pretty specious argument, legally speaking.
There are already 3 challenges, Ejaz, pending in the Supreme Court in connection with the revocation of the special status. One was filed by an independent lawyer, one was filed by a social rights activist, and the other was filed by the Omar Abdullah party, which is the National Conference. And the Supreme Court took up these petitions. It said that it wasn't going to do so with a great sense of urgency, because it believed that the government should get some time to try and ensure normalcy returns to Jammu and Kashmir. But the legality of this has not been judged yet. But like you said, these are the very same points that many critics are also raising here in India, including India's main opposition party, the Congress. It's gone on record to say that while they support to some extent the integration of Jammu and Kashmir with the rest of the country, they're unhappy in the manner in which it was carried out, because on the day that this happened, on August 5th, you had a build-up before that, a 24-hour-long build-up with the government first evacuating tourists from the Jammu and Kashmir Valley, talking about some sort of a terror threat. And also then, like you said, putting many leaders under preventive detention and also suspending all communication lines. And the opposition here in India claims that this was passed with a great degree of haste. Perhaps this should have been debated and discussed at more length. Perhaps there was no need to put all of these democratically elected leaders of Jammu and Kashmir under preventive detention, especially at a time when you're deciding the fate of Jammu and Kashmir people. And many are also saying that the irony is rich because while the rest of the country has applauded the revocation of 370, the people of Kashmir have not had any say on this matter at all.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Neha, Poonia speaking with us from New Delhi. Integration, Moeed. What kind of integration does India speak of? I mean, for years and years and years, we have seen that the Kashmiris are saying, we just don't want to stay with you. I mean, this is, of course, trying to give a fait accompli. This is exercise of great asymmetric power and the rest of it. But as far as the hearts and minds are concerned, it's very unlikely to have any kind of integration.
I personally don't think that's the agenda. Look, I mean, this is as brash and callous a move as you can get from a country that has created an image of itself which talks about inclusivity, secular, you name it. I sit in Washington where, saying a word or two that is critical of India comes with a serious cost.
Yeah.
Even there, I think people are silent, people are questioning, people cannot really defend what has happened. Which tells me that the Indian government has already calculated that it's going to take a hit in terms of its international sort of image. I think Pakistan is winning the at least the international PR or sort of the narrative campaign. The UNSC session that's been called tomorrow now, I think tells you that this idea that this is an internal Indian matter and they'll deal with it is not going to be accepted. All of that there. But what I really see here is an ideological move driven by domestic politics. There have been sort of popular pro-Modi rallies in India based on this, which also tells you that the Hindu right does not really care about 10,000, 20,000 lives going here or there. What I fear really is something close to cleansing after this. Because look, I think there is no question that the Kashmiri youth who were already fed up of what was happening are not going to just take it lying down. I was in India late last year. Even in Delhi, people were talking about the fact that Kashmir is not being handled at all. There's really no policy, etc. So I think the worst is to come. But the fact of the matter is that you now have, at least I think there is evidence that I can convince myself that the conversation about India-Pakistan peace, the conversation about a normal relationship, the conversation about a normal region, you've got to park it for a while. It's not coming. I think this is very well thought out. When you saturate a region with 800,000 troops, there is not much resistance you can put up without losing lives.
As Neha was saying, 150,000, these are additional troops that have been inducted into the valley.
Is that you're talking of millions of people who are in the line of fire, who the Indian state has essentially signaled they don't care about. And so for Pakistan, quite frankly, it's a big dilemma now. People are talking about, oh, Pakistan's giving up on Kashmir, etc. In fact, if there is an argument to be made, the argument is that I don't think there's any other country that would have gone this far to stand up for Kashmir as Pakistan has. 65, 99, whatever, even some of the blunders, you would argue. So, I mean, this idea that Pakistan would kind of just sit back and take it, I don't think that's going to happen at all. But there are millions of people in the line of fire, real line of fire.
Absolutely, and over 9 million people. But let me go back to what you said about the maximalist position in a negotiation sort of thing. So are you suggesting that India has made this move for various reasons, but including the fact that by not only annexing occupied Kashmir, but downgrading the very status of it by making it a union territory, has essentially said that as far as this particular part is concerned, there is no dispute because they are part of us. Now the dispute is with reference to...
But they've done that, right? They've actually included the seats from AJK in what they've done, right? So that's basically changing the goalpost.
Yeah.
I think,
So does that require for us to also change the goalpost? In the sense that, for instance, they used to talk a lot about bilateralism. And the benchmark for bilateralism was Shimla. And then occasionally they would also throw in the Lahore, this thing.
I think
but Shimla was very clear.
Yeah,
that
I think the foreign minister, if I'm
this.
not wrong, the Pakistani foreign minister, I think yesterday or day before, did actually categorically make a statement that India is burying Shimla if this is where they want to go. Yeah. I mean, I think there is something to it.
Yeah.
Also, this UNSC move, by the way, it probably wasn't easy for Pakistan to get this done. So it tells you how absurd this move is.
Yeah.
But also remember, Ejaz, I mean, the last 2 years, time and again, have been about leaders of various countries making bold, absurd, crazy moves, and they're sticking. Right? I mean, people are talking about Israel, but the move, the US embassy moving, the Jerusalem move of the embassy, people thought the Muslim world would be up in arms.
Yeah.
And nothing, right? So maybe that was Modi's calculus as well. What has the Muslim world done so far? Who's come out?
No, the Muslim world is split down the middle right now. If we were to actually look at the the nature of that adversarial relation, they're probably graver adversaries of each other than they are of anyone
May or
else.
may not. The point is, who stood up for what has happened?
Nobody.
That's the point. So, basically Pakistan's fighting this on its own. You know my view on this. I've been accused time and again for being too soft, talking about sort of regional integration and all of that. People like me need to shut up today. It's as simple as that. Because Modi's basically slapped everybody on the face and said, I really don't care. And I'll also tell you, I don't think this is about Kashmir only. This is a larger game in which the ultimate goal remains putting Pakistan in the dock. There was talk about isolationism, isolate Pakistan, didn't work. Now with Afghanistan going in a direction which India doesn't like at all, this is sort of the rear guard action, if you will. But there are a number of other things that are going to follow. I personally cannot at this point see how the LOC cools off with this.
It's not going to cool off.
If it's not
as a matter of fact, talking of Shimla, if India's move essentially undermines that, it unilaterally changes the status quo.
Sure.
And if you extrapolate from there, it also then raises the question of what exactly is the status of the line of control itself.
No, I think that's fair. Where I'm going with this is what happens if there is a skirmish on the line of control. If I'm thinking as India right now, I want to entice Pakistan into some maneuver, which I can then take to the world and say, look, we were telling you these guys regress and whatever.
They could stage manage
This
it.
was in BJP's manifesto. They were saying they're going to do it. Everybody kept saying they're not going to do it. They did it. And now we're playing catch up, right? I do actually commend the Foreign Office for pulling off what they did. I wasn't sure this was going to happen. But there's a long road ahead. And to me...
You're talking about the UNSC.
Yeah, the UNSC. But to me, this is not about real estate. To me, this is not about the LOC. To me, it's about nothing right now. To me, it's about only one thing, which is the 9 million, 10 million, 11 million people who are in the line of fire, who the world will remain silent on if this is not brought to the fore. I don't think I'm expecting too much from anybody in the Muslim world at this point. Either there are no tools or their interests. When you have billions of dollars being invested in India, I think this is a great example again. You have money and you have power, and you're set. And that's where I think this is ending up.
But here's the thing. So the majority of Kashmiris were very clear. For years, they have tried to tell India, as also the rest of the world, that we really don't want to live here. Having said that, there were also a sizable minority, politically, the Quislings, who kind of provided a degree of legitimacy to the Indian rule. Now, these Quislings are all under preventive detention. So as far as these people are concerned, they are now outside of this entire thing because India really does not have any Kashmiri, almost probably literally any Kashmiri, supporting this move.
Look, I'm not saying this, I wouldn't have gone there, but I'm sure you've seen Haaretz and other Western publications talking about the new Hitler and the move. You're being too sensible here. If you hear murmurs of, 8,000-10,000 dead, we don't really care, we'll take care of this, this is going somewhere else. That's why I'm talking about what I'm talking about. This is going to be a serious issue of human life.
And you think that, forget about the Muslim world. There were more demonstrations in the non-Muslim world.
Always.
When America was trying to go into Iraq. So my question is that, heaven forbid, if what we are fearing comes to pass, I hope it does not, because we're talking about human life.
Of course.
But if it does, how would the world, it's one thing to say, because the image of constitutionalism, inclusivity, secularism, and the rest of it is also something on which India has actually built the goodwill that it enjoys today?
No, I mean, now you're talking of something completely different.
No, I'm essentially moving the conversation back to realpolitik, where how is it this going to
look? The first
impact?
thing I'll tell you is, if you want to talk about India, and if I were Indian sitting and watching this, I'd be crying today, because this is real regression. Nothing's going to happen tomorrow or day after, right? But India has guaranteed long-time radicalization from within the Kashmiri youth. I mean, there's just no question about it. You can read whatever literature you want. Whenever states come with this kind of heavy-handed approach in these situations, you're going to have a boomerang effect. It's not going to happen tomorrow. If you have 800,000 troops, of course, people are not going to be able to do much. But this is now the beginning of this spiraling out of control, right? Again, the point is, it will spiral out of control when it does, but you've got human lives and dignity to deal with in the interim. What will the world do? I don't know. I think people will actually look at this. This has to be a human rights campaign, whether it's Pakistan or whoever else is doing this. It doesn't have to be a real estate campaign. The Indian government at this point has already calculated some loss in international stature, and they're willing to go with it. So we've also got to internalize that. I can't see the UNSC standing up for human rights alone tomorrow or a week or 2 weeks from now. But the fact that you're having a debate takes away this idea that, oh, this is now an internal matter, right? So at least that conversation has begun. So it's difficult to say, but I won't be too hopeful. Ultimately, politics will trump this. Ultimately, there are millions and billions of dollars that are going into India. But my argument in Washington, at least right now, is that the US may be heading to a friendless South Asia. I've said this before. But there are two things that keep a strategic partnership going. Interests, in terms of whatever your power projection is, and values to some extent. I think what is being proven now is this idea that India and the US are natural allies. Well, actually, there isn't much natural here. The interest is China. And there, quite frankly, you are beginning to also find evidence that the Indians ain't going to jump ship to the US camp and give up on China. They're going to play this game very delicately. When you go to Moscow, you hear India is the partner. When you go to Delhi, you hear Moscow is more important than the US. So I think the US South Asia strategy is in trouble at the end of the day. This idea that the Indo-Pacific and the Indians will stand shoulder to shoulder against China, I don't see it happening. The idea that this is constitutionalism, this is secularism, this is the inclusive India versus the exclusive Pakistan, I think we're seeing that happen.
I think that chapter is closed. But I'm going to take a short break and then return to discuss the western side of Pakistan, which is Afghanistan. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. Another round of talks aimed at resolving nearly 2 decades of fighting in Afghanistan has ended without a deal. But the Trump administration is moving ahead regardless, with plans to substantially cut the number of US troops and also diplomats in that country. Zalmay Khalilzad, the administration's special envoy for Afghan peace talks, was headed back to Washington on Wednesday to consult the next steps after what he described as 10 days of productive talks with Taliban leaders in Qatar that focused on technical issues. I hope this is the last Eid where Afghanistan is at war, he said in a Twitter message marking the Islamic holiday. I know Afghans yearn for peace. We stand with them and are working hard toward a lasting and honorable peace agreement in a sovereign Afghanistan which poses no threat to any other country. So this is where the situation stands. Incidentally, the Taliban also released, as a goodwill gesture, they released some prisoners from the Afghan National Security Forces. For the discussion on Afghanistan, we still have Moeed Yusuf with us. We're also joined by Mariam, who is an analyst and activist from Afghanistan. Moeed, what exactly is happening? I mean, going into the 8th round, there was a sense that there will be something solid on the paper. The Taliban at the end of it said that, we've reached a deal. The Americans didn't give any details, but Zalmay was saying that, this looks pretty good. He was very optimistic. But where's the fine print?
I mean, of course, we don't know, but my own sense is that this is, they've gone around in circles on these two issues. One is the ceasefire, which the US and the international community and the Afghan government want, and the other one is troop withdrawal, or at least a clear plan of a troop withdrawal down to zero, which is what the Taliban want. And the fine print is whether zero is good enough for the Taliban, whether they want this to happen in a year or 2 years or now or whatever it is. And for the US side, ceasefire. And what does ceasefire mean? I mean, you have a ceasefire and there are attacks, and then what happens? So I think it's somewhere there. But quite frankly, keep in mind that this entire negotiation process is the precursor to the real negotiation process.
Which is likely to be even more difficult.
That's correct. So, the idea that we're very close to a peace deal, I think is a misnomer. We may be very close to starting a real peace process. And there, I think it does look good if both sides are signaling that they're close. This fine print probably will be worked out pretty soon.
Okay. Mariam, this is a very important point raised by Moeed that, peace deal is a misnomer because we're still looking at a process, and it's gone on for nearly a year. And with the benefit of the hindsight, it seems that this particular phase was probably easier to deal with than the next one, which will be hopefully the intra-Afghan dialogue, given the multiple fault lines within Afghanistan, politically and otherwise.
I think that you're absolutely correct. This is the most simple process, and what's going to come ahead. Who I blame exactly here is the Afghan government for the fact that President Ghani was on this ticket to bring peace, but in the past 5 years, he had taken his High Peace Council representative, Masoom Stanekzai, and turned him into the Minister of Defense. So what does that translate to the public? That translates to the public that we're not going to make peace, but we're going to go to war. And then Masoom Stanekzai was not accepted by Parliament, and then he became the head of the National Directorate of Security, the chief.
Correct.
So the public, however, has stepped back, and I think that they're in the mentality that the Taliban will not come and that we should continue fighting them. So I believe that the inter-Afghan dialogue is going to be very difficult, and I feel that the Afghan government is responsible for this, that the Afghan people don't want to accept the Taliban. So it's going to be a very difficult process ahead. There will be, I believe, other attacks. We have other actors that don't want the peace to occur. So you have ISIS here, we have criminal activity. So there's going to be so many factors, and I feel that the Taliban will get blamed, or maybe in some cases their own foot soldiers that are going to jump ship will cause many hinders to the process. But again, I think that it's the government's responsibility to mold the public's mind to accept the Afghan Taliban to reintegrate into society. But there has been nothing done on that step.
Okay, so the Taliban have already said that they're not going to accept the presidential elections. They've actually asked people to stay away from casting their votes. This is, of course, something that will be very difficult for President Ghani to accept, because when there was some talk of possibly some kind of interim arrangement while the dialogue was going on and the rest of it, he basically said that will be completely unacceptable. But there are fissures within his government also. So where exactly so when we talk about, in theory, when we talk about the Kabul government or the Taliban talking to the Kabul government, who exactly are we talking about? Because it's not a particularly unified government to begin with.
No, it's not a unified government, which is, I think, one of the main aspects why the Afghan Taliban are not interested in speaking to the government, and they rather have an intra-Afghan dialogue. And if there are representatives from the government, they want them to attend in an individual capacity. But I do agree that we need to recognize the government of any sorts. And I think one of the aspects that my colleague with you didn't mention that we're having a huge issue with when during discussion is the interpretation of Islam. The Afghan Taliban do not accept the Afghan government's interpretation and how it's not represented as much in the constitution, but the Afghan government and the Afghan people don't accept the Afghan Taliban's Afghan Taliban's interpretation of Islam. Mm-hmm. What I have noticed and I've suggested to others is to ask for Islamic scholars to attend these talks. The Afghan government have not incorporated them in their delegation, and neither have the U.S. delegation. So I'm quite concerned on how this is going to move forward, because that is the main aspect that's going to be the issue with the intra-Afghan dialogue. I feel that the Afghan government, again, is at fault here because they have not prepared themselves or any of the individuals who are attending. I don't know if you recall, but the first time the Afghan Taliban wanted to have a discussion with the Afghan government had a list of 250 people. And in response, the Afghan Taliban said that this is not an Afghan wedding. We want a smaller number and we want to have a committee. So that it just tells me how ill-prepared the government is. And I don't know if this is a tactic to stall it or to delay it and just move forward so we fall into election and then deal with this 5 years later. But I feel that we as the public that are watching this and who are stakeholders, we need to push for this because we have the momentum right now.
Mm-hmm. So how do you enter Islam? I mean, that's like a veritable minefield.
I remember, and you'll remember in Pakistan's case when this committee was put together, where the final report on that was very interesting, that if we started to get consensus, you'd have 49 or 50, every one of them would have a different interpretation to put out. So I'm not sure what that means. Look, I mean, I think the bottom line here is that the Taliban, this argument that the Taliban have changed over time, they've mellowed, they've sort of become different than they were in the 90s. Maybe, maybe not. Most likely, yes. But this group has not been coherent for the past 20 years. They've been in hiding. They've been, dispersed. They haven't had a collective identity to speak of. My own guess is that when you come together as a group and negotiate from what you believe is a position of strength. Remember, the Taliban think that they're doing really well on the battlefield and can basically outlast the US presence. Then this idea of the emirate will come back. You will want to go.
No, it's there. I mean, every time they put out a press release, it is from the Islamic Emirate.
No, that's correct. What I'm saying is that the idea that you will mellow and be more inclusive may be the starting point, but once you gain power and space, you would always want to go back to the original.
So Mariam's suggestion that they should pull in Islamic scholars, which can sort of, perhaps put together some acceptable baseline definition of what we're talking about.
I know where that's coming from, but the problem is it's not about the letter. I actually don't think the Taliban are going to have too much of a problem with the constitution as it is. I mean, it is an Islamic constitution. They may want to change a word here or two words there or whatever. That's not the issue. The issue is, how do you interpret that letter when you actually translate it into practice? There you won't have scholars who will be able to help. It's about power. And once you have space, let's say you come up with a power sharing arrangement and the Taliban keep control of the areas that they currently control in Afghanistan. Who's going to determine how much of that letter is going to be implemented in the way it was originally envisaged versus whatever the local commanders want to do? It's going to be the people who are controlling it. It's the Taliban. In other places, it's going to be the government or whatever else there is. So I think it's a bigger problem than just interpreting the letter. I don't think there's going to be too much of a disconnect on interpreting the letter. Sharia is already part of the constitution. It really is an Islamic constitution in its embodiment. How you actually implement it, to me, that will be determined by what power sharing arrangement you come up with.
So I totally agree with you, because at the end of the day, it is about that power configuration. But Mariam, you remember our Prime Minister, Imran Khan, talked about the fact that the Taliban delegation wanted to meet with him. He said that he could not because he wasn't sure if Kabul would like that. But now that he's met with President Ghani and also with President Trump, he would very likely meet with the Taliban delegation. Now, if that were to happen, how do you think he should go about it?
Excellent question, something that I'm really eager to discuss. But before, I would like to mention something about what my counterpart mentioned. You know, we had a ceasefire for 3 days, and the foot soldiers of the Taliban had entered the cities. So we had approximately around 30 to 40,000 of them enter, and these were a young generation. So we're noticing a shift of generation of the young Taliban, and these were the guys that were taking selfies with young women, that were having ice cream, playing music, dancing on the streets, being really helpful for some people, opening car doors. So I don't think that the younger generation is as harsh, and I think they're really eager to reintegrate into society. Just like there's a generation transition within the Afghan government. So I think that once we reintegrate and we communicate and we engage on a more progressive and positive level, I think that we will notice that there is going to be a shift in mentality. Going to the question that you asked, I think that Prime Minister Imran Khan should first communicate with President Ashraf Ghani and discuss certain things. Followed that and discuss with other regional actors what are the most important points, and then meet with the Taliban. I think that he could have a positive influence in this aspect. I think he could push certain narratives that are really important. And I think that any individual that wants to influence the process in a positive way that could best benefit the Afghan people and the region and the world community as a whole is a great deed.
Okay, so that's something which you think can have a positive impact in terms of how the Taliban begin to look at the intra-Afghan dialogue. But there's always this, there's another sort of issue lurking, which is, and I think that was something that Khan did not really say, but that is something which he realizes, which every Pakistani realizes, and that is that if Pakistan were to play a role that goes beyond a certain point, then it exposes itself to the allegation that it is unnecessarily interfering with that process. Would you agree with that?
If he independently acts and does not communicate with the government of Afghanistan or other regional actors, then yes. Mm-hmm. I would believe that would be odd. But if he engages with all governments in the region and discuss certain issues, security, political, social, and brings those issues to the table where he could possibly have any influence, why not?
Okay. Thank you. That was Wardak speaking with us. Before we wrap up, let me just go back to the power configuration thing that you were talking about. I remember you did this study on insurgencies, various sort of case studies. What are those? So just give me the takeaways which actually sort of link up with the situation in Afghanistan.
Well, I mean, the first one is this is not a classic counterinsurgency because the principal counterinsurgent is an external party. So the insurgent is always going to have the upper hand in terms of waiting them out. Second, if I were the insurgent, I would basically be looking for a deal right now because I also cannot last, for eternity. I also am under pressure from ISIS. The Taliban feel that the ISIS is being created to put them under pressure. Also, crucially, no regional country is now telling the Taliban that they'll back them to the end. Everybody is pushing them to strike a deal. So what do? You strike a deal, strike a compromise deal, and once you have that, then you start encroaching on the other space and try and see how close you can get to total dominance. That's what I expect, quite frankly, this to be. Third, you've got to figure out how you're going to sustain Afghanistan, because one of your biggest lessons from the 90s as the Taliban is, if you're totally isolated, Afghanistan will collapse because there'll be no money. That, I think, is what the international community should be looking towards, to hold the Taliban back from going too far in terms of encroaching on the power space. There, it's crucial then that they are not isolated, but the world continues to engage them, even the areas that are under their control, to keep them in the fold, force them to mellow down, and make sure that there's some semblance of governance that is taking place, or modern governance that's taking place in those areas.
So I think the Taliban, I'm assuming that they are alive to the fact that there's not much in the Afghan coffers.
Yeah.
President Ghani also knows this. I mean, apart from about 9% which they generate internally for their revenues, everything else comes from outside.
Yep.
So the Taliban would also be perhaps, in terms of, for instance, the areas that they control, if they were to begin to exercise local governance there, they would obviously need the UN funding and funding from various other, and that will have some kind of impact on how they approach.
So I think what you're seeing in Afghanistan then is going to be a balancing act between wanting to encroach and dominate in terms of the political power, and needing to remain internationally relevant and not isolated, and thus pulling back from that urge, right? That's the balance. Wherever that balance, whatever comes off it, is going to be the Taliban of the future Afghanistan. Also keep in mind that we talk of the government of President Ghani. That's not going to last. Elections or no elections. What you're talking about is Taliban versus those who want to be part of the system but are not the Taliban. These are not all anti-Taliban forces. So the Taliban will also be cutting deals with whoever's in the fold of the government, but not part of it.
Absolutely. So finally and quickly, so what we see actually are satrapies. Like Atta and Dostam and others. These are satrapies. And so Kabul does not really exercise central control. And so it's a process of negotiations. Where I think Taliban is another factor into
That's correct. So keep in mind that if the balance goes in the direction of political power rather than internationalization of the Taliban, you also have a strong possibility of complete breakdown and anarchy, which is a full-fledged civil war, and that probably is the single most dangerous scenario for Pakistan. So
we'll be thrown back to the 90s.
Correct. And I don't think you can rule that out. And thus, I think right now there is a genuine convergence between Pakistan, US, and Afghan political actors, not the government, which is push everybody to a deal, get the intra-Afghan conversation going, and push for internationalization of the Taliban rather than isolation. The Afghan government, of course, wants an election, 5 more years, and then worry about the peace process. I think that's a non-starter.
I think, that's a non-starter. But thank you so much, Dr. Moeed, Yusuf. This is all for today. We shall see you tomorrow. Until then, it's goodbye.